This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Well, as a specialist or as an expert, intelligent experts, how did you react when we heard that intelligence communities were communicating information, but the people who were supposed to receive it weren't particularly interested in it? Apparently, there were emails that were delivered. Is that not proof of incompetence? I wouldn't use that word. I would say perhaps it wasn't very sophisticated. Because, when you're talking about incompetence, you're talking about individuals. I don't think individuals are incompetent, but the system isn't mature. And in the book that I co-authored with Mr. Carvin, we interviewed many, many people. And the reality is that the political concerns, the appetite for this kind of intelligence is rather small. Well, then that's serious. Because it's all very well to give all the resources you need to the intelligence community, but if that information just ends up in a black hole, people won't know about it. And you referred to politicians, but we are elected representatives and we have a major role to play. So you spoke to partisanship. However, partisanship is healthy in a democracy. Absolutely. I think that your work is absolutely necessary. So it's important to have hearings like these ones in PROC. But I'd like to get back to my question because we went off on a tangent. How is it that after all these years and all these studies, we are in a situation where a minister receives information that they can't access and people treat it as being normal? There's no investigation. There's nothing was done. Well, Mr. Carvin and myself did research, and that showed that the appetite on the part of the government is limited for this kind of information. I think it would be appropriate to acknowledge that there has been progress. The system is working better than it used to 10 or 20 years ago. There is some progress. However, they're starting. They had a very late start, so we aren't necessarily where we should be at.
Mike Chong is a good friend of mine, and frankly, what happened to him, I think, is outrageous, and there's a real lack of credibility in the story that the government is putting forward, and I think it's causing a lot of distrust in our institutions. And Mr. Junot, I want to ask you a couple of questions. In your opening testimony, you said that we need to create a cabinet committee. We need to build up this credibility, national security review, but it's really important that people at the top, Canadians have confidence in the people at the top. I was just curious, when you were hired at your university, it's a pretty important job that you have. Did they give you an email address?
Yeah.
They did? And because it's very important that people around you, your boss, your students communicate with you, how many days did it take you to figure out how that email address worked?
About 3 minutes.
It did, okay. Information about Mr. Chong was sent to the former Minister of Public Safety in May of 2021, and apparently the Minister and his staff did not see that information because he didn't know his own login credentials to access these emails. I find that incredible. I was just wondering, how would that happen? Like, what do you make of that? You've worked in government. Can you explain that to the average Canadian, how that would work?
Well, to be frank, in narrow terms, the fact that the minister would not use his top secret email, I don't think is surprising, and I don't think is a problem. Ministers have staff who will manage email for them, especially on a highly classified system. You cannot have a top secret system in the minister's office because then the whole minister's office becomes a top secret zone, which means that everything becomes extremely complicated.
But don't you think that if, this is public safety for the entire country, that the person in charge of that should at least know his login credentials, maybe not, whatever the system is, but people around him should be responsible to inform him? Because I find this unbelievable that he says he didn't have access to those emails. And I find that you are sticking up for him here. I can criticize an individual, but I find that outrageous.
I'm not sticking up for the minister or for anybody else. I just think that in this or any other government, it is not for a minister to manage his or her own email. So that specific aspect of, especially on highly classified systems.
A top secret email, the guy at the top.
Sorry, I'm just going to pause real quick.
Sure.
We can just pause the time. Mr. Carey, I appreciate you being at committee tonight. It's always a privilege to have people come visit because this, to me, is the place to be. But at this committee, one person speaks at a time, and we go back and forth because the two official languages are of utmost importance, and it helps the work of the interpreters. So we keep eye contact with each other, and then we just give a turn to each other, but two people do not speak at the same time. With that, I will give the floor back to you, Mr. Carey, and this time was not taken away from your time.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to apologize. I was getting a little emotional about it. What do you make of the fact that it took the previous Minister of Public Safety 4 months to give CSIS the authority to monitor a politician they identified and who had long been on their radar? 4 months. Mr. Juneau, sure. Why don't we stay there?
I find that in the absence of more information, it's very difficult to come to a clear conclusion on that. It seems long. Based on what is out in public, it seems too long, but it's hard to say more specifically than that.
Yeah, Mr. Wark, do you have I'm curious what you think. Please explain it to the ordinary Canadian.
Madam Chair, I would simply say that my understanding is the committee is going to hear from the minister in question, Bill Blair, I think tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And obviously the question should be addressed to him. I would only note that Minister Blair publicly said that the Globe and Mail report alleging that that it took 4 months for this action to take place was in error. So perhaps he will clarify that. If I could come back to your previous question about trying to understand the kind of intelligence flows that come into ministers and their staff, I would just say two things. One is the intelligence flows are extremely voluminous, and there are multiple classified systems to handle different levels of classification. So it's not a simple system. It's not a matter of having our university email logins available to us and not forgetting them. I think that is a bit of a caricature of a complex reality. It's not to excuse the fact that the intelligence can get lost, and that is inexcusable. But I do want to draw attention to another issue, which is that, as best we know from media reporting, what is being discussed here, at least initially, was a 9-page intelligence assessment in which this component of a warning about the targeting of unnamed MPs was frankly buried in the middle. And that comes back to an important issue, which is that it is incumbent on intelligence agencies and those who frame their reports and their analysis to be very clear about what they think is significant information. Because you cannot expect a minister or a staff or a senior deputy minister in the government to read through 9 pages and say, aha, there was this vague reference in the middle of this report that I really should have paid attention to. But actually, nobody asked me to do that. So I do think that there's a larger systemic issue here, which is not just governance, as Mr. Johnson indicates, but is larger than that, as I said, around intelligence cycle issues. Get the collection right, get the analysis right, get the reporting right, and raise the bar on culture issues. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
I have a question for both of you, but perhaps we'll start with Professor Wark. One of the reasons that was given to not go ahead with an independent public inquiry was the sensitive nature of the information. But this morning there are witnesses who told us that when you're talking about foreign interference, you're really speaking about low-hanging fruit. So it's less sensitive than, say, spying or things like that. So could you kind of give us, tell us what level of sensitivity or what level of sensitive nature we're talking about compared to other cases? And if too much weight is given to the issue of national security, is there not a risk of overclassifying information and then the public doesn't have access to enough information?
Madam Chair, thank you for the question. Again, just to begin by agreeing completely with my colleague Thomas Junot that there are systematic, persistent problems with overclassification. I don't think those are going to be solved solely through a focus on foreign interference issues. In terms of, and it's an important question around how, what is the level of sensitivity we're talking about in holding either a judicial inquiry or public hearings on foreign interference. It is, I think, has to be understood as extremely high. And I think it also has to be said that some of the media revelations based on leaked documents clearly compromise what are often called Canadian sources and methods, because they refer, among other things, to the contents of intercepted communications flowing between Chinese diplomatic officials in Canada. And there's only one way in which that material can be gathered. So there are sources and methods at stake, which is at the heart of the information you have to protect. It is also, I think, important to understand that you cannot hold a judicial inquiry into foreign interference without considering where the trends are going, what's ahead, what are the current operations, what are the current investigations, what are the challenges they face. Again, all of that would have to be protected by, I think, a very heavy and high curtain of secrecy. Now, public hearings are going to have to deal with that same issue of secrecy, but are not going to try and penetrate it, but they're going to try and get at the general issues. And I think that is the more valuable proposition for Canadians.
Très rapidement.
Very quickly, I absolutely agree with what Mr. Wark said. But I would repeat what I said in my opening remarks earlier and what I have stated in the media over the past few weeks. This issue of overclassifying information, I think, can be used against the holding of a public inquiry, and that's not very convincing to my mind. You can hold inquiries even if there is classified information involved. There is important information to be provided to the public. I think that the added value of an inquiry would be limited. So I think that the benefits are somewhat exaggerated, and it's underestimating what other venues there are. Thank you very much.
My question is to Mr. Wark, Madam Chair. I heard him say that we need a Security Council chaired by the Prime Minister here in Canada. Given how polarized Canada's become in the last 8 years, how do you think that would increase the trust by Canadians in our national security? Mr. Wark, please.
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. Through you, I don't think any of us imagine that any particular change, institutional change to the machinery of government is going to necessarily solve that larger issue around trust and understanding of national security threats and responses. I think the benefit of a cabinet committee chaired by the Prime Minister is just, it speaks to that question of kind of raising the culture of intelligence within the federal government at the most senior level to ensure that there is a cabinet committee chaired by the Prime Minister seized by these kinds of issues and capable of looking ahead to threats that are on the horizon, as opposed to something like the Incident Response Group, which is a purely emergency committee that is reactive and short-term.
Madam Chair, thank you. One more question for Mr. Johnson. How productive can the hearings, Mr. Wark, you spoke about the hearings by Mr. Johnson. How can those hearings be productive given the epidemic of overclassification mentioned by Mr. Juneau? Do you agree with Mr. Juneau that there's an epidemic of overclassification?
I do agree with my colleague, Professor Juneau, that overclassification is a problem, and it's not unique to Canada, but we certainly suffer from it. And one of the ideas contained for the agenda of public hearings that Mr. Johnson has proposed, as you'll know, is to tackle that declassification issue, to see if something could be done to include.
Thank you, Mr. Wark.